Hello, welcome to another episode of Pastor's Perspective, sponsored by Biola University, ranked as the most comprehensively Christian school in North America. I'm Michael David, and on today's program, we have on the PhilCam, Phil Metzger from Calvary San Diego. His church's website is calvarysd.com. In studio, we have John Huang. He is the pastor of Christ Point City Church in Huntington Beach, and you can get more information at christpointcity.com. Also in the studio, we have your longtime host, Brian Perez, here. He's celebrating Halloween by wearing a ghost costume. He's dressed like a ghost since it's October 31st, and he's all ready for the Halloween party he's going to be attending later this evening in Hollywood. But I guess he'll be a mute ghost on today's episode, and that's because Brian is not here today. He's taking a well-deserved afternoon off, but like a lot of listeners, including myself, you may know someone who's going to be dressed like a ghost. In fact, I got some friends who are non-believers. They told me their daughter is going to be dressed like a ghost this afternoon. So if you have any questions about Halloween or dressing up or anything on the Christian faith, how to live the Christian life, give us a call, 888-564-6173. Again, 888-564-6173. Well, gentlemen, thank you for being on the program today.
I see Bobby Conway.
Hey,
Bobby Conway is here. Okay. Bobby, let me go ahead and say Bobby Conway is here too. He's on the Bobby Cam. He's from Image Church in Charlotte, North Carolina. You can hear him on Christianity Still Makes Sense, the radio program, and you see him on the Christianity Still Makes Sense channel on YouTube. Bobby, welcome to the program.
Hey guys, good to be with you.
Well, what do you guys have planned for tonight at your churches, if anything, right now? Or did you have something at your churches?
Oh, I'm probably going to visit Phil's church, and then I'm going to fly over to Bobby's church. I just want to see what they're doing for Halloween.
Oh man!
Yeah, we got a big Halloween fest that starts at 6 to 9, and we'll have tons of kids, tons of families. We've turned our sanctuary into a roller skating rink indoors, so it's going to be really fun.
Awesome. There's so many great events going on. If your church is doing something, we definitely encourage you to be a part of that. Give of your time, your talent, your treasures, and just be there for the kids so that they can have a good time where they can be safe physically and spiritually.
Does your sanctuary still have that slope, or did you leveled that one out?
We flattened it and made it like a basketball, like a concrete with a basketball court kind of a deal, and then stadium seating as well. So
amazing. I think a sloped roller derby would be amazing.
It would be amazing.
Right?
But yeah, this seems a little safer.
All right. Well, cool. Well, everybody have a good, safe time tonight. Again, this is Pastor's Perspective. If you want to talk to John Huang, Phil Metzger, or Dr. Bobby Conway, the number to call is 888-564-6173. We'll start off with some of the Facebook questions. You contact us on Facebook at Facebook Messenger. The first one comes from CJ. He says, "Hello, pastors. My question today is, when does a marriage count as a marriage biblically? Is it when it's legal and government and has a contract, or is it when two people say that they are married? Some seem to think that a boyfriend and girlfriend devoted to each other are considered married in God's eyes. I would love to know your thoughts, pastors, and thank you for your time." Let's start with Dr. Bobby Conway.
Well, when we look at the scriptures, one of the things that we have to realize is that the Bible takes place in various cultures, and cultures have different ways of making a wedding take place, so to speak. And there's freedoms when it comes to what the ceremony looks like, but the purpose of marriage is two people covenanting together. So in our country, because we're to obey the laws of the land, we can't just go about and say, I'm married, because, part of the process in the United States is we have to register that marriage. So for somebody to say, hey, let's just say we're married in God's eyes, well, I think God would want us to follow the process as well. But technically speaking, yes, when two people commit before the Lord that they are married, and then they would go turn a marriage license in, and the way that that's done is through somebody who is officiating. And so there are always going to be those that might want to, go rogue and just have their ceremony themselves and say, let's marry each other right now. And I get that if you're stranded on an island, there's no one else there, and your boyfriend and girlfriend, and you just make a covenant before the Lord. You don't have a legal system and a court system to go and, get a license. You don't have anybody to, do the wedding for you. Sure, I think you're married. But in this culture, I think most churches would see that if two people at home just decided to say we're married, that wouldn't count, and it wouldn't count for the state. And so I think that it's important that you have an officiator. And if you're Christians, it's before the Lord. If you're not Christians, you're going to make the commitments of the state.
All right. Phil Metzger, did you want to say something?
Yeah, totally agree. I think that, the world is, ever changing in terms of how we understand what makes a legal wedding. And of course, I would even, just to the person who was asking the question, they were like, if you just say you're married, are you married? No, unless you are stranded, I guess. Yeah. If this is a castaway or something with two of you, maybe then that counts. But, there's so many different cultures and different expressions of that. And this is where the importance of, especially back in the day, the church had a real value to being a part of that officiating and that governing process. Today, I've had people I did in Eastern Europe and here, hey, we want to get married, and can we just have you do a marriage, a wedding ceremony? No, there's a process here in America for how we do weddings. There's a process in Europe and Eastern Europe and so on. And we are to obey those that are in authority over us. And so if there is that process and it's not infringing upon our faith in any way, which it is not, then we should use that. So definitely don't just decide that you're married, because then you could just easily decide you're not married, right? So what's
Right.
what's the covenant? What does covenant look like when I'm deciding to get married? Then I'm also deciding to not be married. So I think we definitely need to not only bring God into that, but the way in which God designed it to be officiated.
Now, John Huang, you were a youth pastor for many years, working with young adults. Did you see this sometimes in your ministry?
Well, I mean, hopefully, if there were anybody that was thinking that, I hope that I'd be able to steer them away from that way of thinking. One thing that I see in Scripture is, for example, in the process of divorce, right? Jesus spoke about how Moses issued a certificate of divorce. So, I mean, if this was just, two people saying, hey, let's just feel it and let's just like each other a lot and just say that we're married, then in the process of divorce, then what's the whole legal process for, right? And so, I mean, if there is a legal process out, then the assumption is there was some kind of covenant binding, legal process in. And so even when you look at when Jesus shows up at the wedding feast of Cana, it was a wedding ceremony. And so Jesus was giving his stamp of approval on that ceremony by being there. His presence was there. And I think that for every couple that is considering marriage, I think that that's a thing that we always want to do, is we want to invite Jesus into our wedding. And one of the beautiful ways of doing that is, like we see in John chapter 2, have a wedding ceremony. Now, obviously, it doesn't have to be as elaborate as a lot of these Jewish weddings, but the idea is there needs to be this uniting in the presence of witnesses and ultimately before God, and there needs to be someone that represents the Lord. Now, like Bobby was saying, in our culture, we've got different people that can now officiate weddings. If you're out in open waters, you can have the captain of a boat, you could have a judge. But for us who are believers, there's something so beautiful and something so powerful about making a clear statement that we are being joined together as, the Bible says, this mystical, mysterious, beautiful union where two people become one before the Lord. And we get to do it not only, just amongst ourselves, but for the rest of our lives, to be an ongoing witness of this union that exists between Jesus and his bride, the church.
Great answer, John and Phil and Dr. Bobby Conway on Pastor's Perspective. Again, the number to call is 888-564-6173. We'll take one more Facebook question before we go to the phones. This is from Vera. She says, hello to all my favorite men of God. Sorry, I can't call. I'm usually working when the show is on, but I listen every day on Spotify. She has a question from Hebrews chapter 7, verse 17, which says, you are a priest forever after the order of Melchizedek. I know this is talking about Jesus, but who is Melchizedek and what order is it referring to? I appreciate you guys so much. I love listening. God bless you. Let's start with Mr. Phil Metzger this time. What do you say?
Great. Yeah, it's a great question. It's one that comes up quite a bit. In the book of Genesis, we read about this person named Melchizedek, and he is a king and a priest. And in many ways, his whole entrance and kind of then exit, in a sense, is quite dramatic. He's kind of there, and then he's not there. And in this sense, the author of Hebrews is referring to Jesus as a type of, like that, Melchizedek is like a type of Christ and so on. And so there's people with different views of who Melchizedek is. Of course, some would say that Melchizedek was an appearance of Jesus in the Old Testament. Others, and I would put myself in this, that he was a real king and he was a real priest and he was uniquely connected in relationship with the living God. And he met with Abraham and Abram at the time. And so, but Melchizedek in Hebrews chapter 7, then you're looking at like this mysterious kind of unique king, priest person and how he is a type of Christ.
All right. Very good answer. Dr. Bobby, did you want to say something?
No, that was great.
All right. Very good. Very good. Well, having said that, let's go to the first caller calling for Virginia at 888-564-6173. It's Luke. Luke, welcome to the program.
Hey, gentlemen. Thank you so much for taking my call today. My question has to do with the Olivet Discourse. I'm looking specifically in Mark 13, but obviously it's mirrored in some of the other Gospels. The reason I'm calling is because I've had some confusion about this lately. Growing up in kind of the non-denominational style of churches, I was always told that when Jesus talks about wars and rumors of wars and earthquakes, I was taught at least that this was going to be a sign of his second coming. Now, a recent, I don't know if this is an interpretation or just a correction of a misinterpretation, but a recent teaching that I received on this was that no, Jesus is saying, do not look to these things. Don't be worried about them. Those are not a sign of my second coming. The sign of my second coming is the abomination of desolation. So I guess what I'm asking is this just two differing interpretations, or is one side misinformed on this?
All right. That's a good question. Dr. Bobby, did you want to take that one?
It's going to depend on maybe your eschatology. Some people, if they're a preterist, they're going to say it's referring to the signs of the time and the coming destruction of Jerusalem that took place when Rome sacked them in AD 70. Others would keep it entirely out in the future, and some would say there's an already not yet fulfillment.
Mm-hmm. All right, very good. Dr. John, Pastor John, would you like to say something?
No, I think that this is one of those passages of Scripture that we can just expect that different pastors are going to have different opinions on it because, like Bobby said, we're so often it's like we start from our conclusions and then we work backwards on this. And so if your tradition has been something like what Bobby was saying, thinking more of what happened in 70 AD, or you're looking at the second coming of Christ, that's going to impact it. Because if you are looking at this as referring to the return, the visible return of Jesus, then the way I understand this passage is that if you were to overlap it with Revelation chapters 6 through 18, it seems that these events that are being spoken spoken of are what we would refer to as the tribulation period. If you're familiar with Dallas Theological Seminary and the late well-known chancellor of Dallas, which was John Walvoord, he advocated strongly for that position that this is talking about the tribulation. So for any person to look at Matthew 24, this passage in Mark, and to say, hey, look at all that's being fulfilled today, the problem with that is for those that hold to a pre-trib rapture is now you've put the church in the tribulation. And so I actually personally, and I'm glad this program is called Pastor's Perspective, I actually take more of an eclectic approach. I do like what Bobby said, and I appreciate that he mentioned this, and already and not yet. I do look at the Olivet Discourse. On one hand, Jesus is talking about the destruction of Jerusalem, but I also do understand this passage as looking further out to the events of the return of Jesus Christ. And so that's why for me, like when I talk with people and they, one person lands on 70 AD, another person lands on the second coming of Christ, I have no problem with either of those thoughts or opinions on it. But on the side of the return of Jesus, I do believe that Jesus is talking about specific things that will happen leading up to the return of Christ.
All right, very good. Phil, did you want to say something?
No, I think they did a great job.
All right, very good. Luke from Virginia, thank you for calling us at 888-564-6173. We're going to go to Nikki in Menifee now. Nikki, how can we help you?
Hello. Thank you as well for taking my call. So right now, my question would be I'm dealing with trust issues with my brother, and it's just consuming my mind, and I don't want to be consumed with, is he, can I trust him? Can I not trust him? I just want to go straight to the Lord and have the Lord just, calm me down and just focus on him. So where do I look? Or, because I know Jesus has an answer for everything. So I just want help with my mind, that it doesn't get consumed with these things that are in reality not important.
Those are great questions. Great questions, Nikki. Phil Metzger, what would you say?
Yeah, Nikki, I agree with Michael. Those are great questions. And I don't think that one answer is going to solve all things, but I can mention a few things, and I'm sure my amazing brothers will have other thoughts as well to add in. Let's just start with this. And you said it there, like, I trust God, I love God, and so on. Let me encourage you in this. The practice of, like, there's a discipline involved in like growing in confidence in God. It's the Bible, describes us as having a faith, right? And faith is a muscle. We have an opportunity to exercise it like a muscle is what I meant to say. And so I think as you spend time, like kind of very consistently and regularly, you spend time setting your mind on the things of God, things that he has, meditating, as Philippians says, on whatever is true and pure and lovely and of a good report, letting yourself have the mind of Christ, as the Bible tells us to have. This is a discipline. You can't assume that like you could just like go through a hard thing and then immediately and instantly just be able to trust God and to have peace and contentment as you walk through difficult things. We have to practice the presence of God. We have to practice the disciplines of trusting him and allowing him to work in our lives. And so I always like to encourage people, listen, if we want to trust God in those big moments, we need to be regularly practicing trusting him in small things and not just like letting our life go. It's easy to just let life happen. Most of the time in the United States, life will generally go pretty much okay, kind of day to day. But to actually really truly just say, I'm going to, in every moment of my day to day, I'm going to trust God. I'm going to not just let things go, but I'm going to say, Lord, I'm going to trust you for my meeting today. I'm going to trust you with this conversation, and then really lean into the Lord. It's a real discipline to put our faith in God on the regular daily things. And as we do that, we're going to be surprised that we become more and more confident and able to trust him as the situations around us get bigger. One last thought. Sometimes God's just so faithful and gracious in those moments too. Even if I've not been like really great at doing all the trusting God is faithful to just carry me through. And I need to trust in his goodness and his faithfulness. Even if I've not been doing so great and not been where I should be, I can still lean into his goodness and faithfulness for my life.
Absolutely. Yeah, that's a tough situation. Very, very tough situation. John, I mean, what have you ever had that situation before or known someone who did?
Oh, yeah. I mean, obviously, this is something that just happens to people. But I just wanted to ask Nikki for clarification. So, Nikki, are you saying that you're having trust issues with God or with your brother?
No, with my brother.
Okay.
For sure.
All right. So, the thing with trust with people, obviously, trust is an earned commodity, right? I think that there are certain people that we walk into relationships and we are very generous with trust until that trust is broken. And for that trust to be, regained, it takes time. And so, Again, not knowing the backstory to why you called or why you're asking this question, obviously there are things that have happened that is causing you to feel uneasy about entrusting trust toward your brother. But here's the great thing, like Phil said, the one person that we can confidently rely on as the trustworthy one, the one that's never going to fail us, is the Lord. I think that in every human relationship, we just need to understand that we are all broken people, and in some way or some point or another, we are going to break trust with somebody, and so I think that rather than just accepting that and just say, well, then I just guess I have to give everybody a pass. No, trust is still a valuable thing, especially as relationships, the circle just becomes smaller and tighter, right? Like there should be trust between a husband and a wife. There should be trust between parents and kids. There should be trust with your friends. And so as the circle gets smaller and tighter, you would expect trust to be there. But the way that we're able to relate to other people on a horizontal level is like what Phil was saying, is that we make sure that we cultivate that vertical relationship with God. As you were asking your question, the scripture that immediately came to my mind was Romans chapter 12, verses 1 and 2, where Paul says, I appeal to you, therefore, brothers, by the mercies of God, to present your bodies as a living sacrifice, holy and acceptable to God, which is your spiritual worship. And then he says, do not be conformed to this world, because everything in this world is broken, right? And everything in this world presents a distorted view of who God is. And that's why this world is so messed up. But for us who are believers, he says, but be transformed by the renewal of your mind. So it's like Phil was saying, if you continue to cultivate right thinking about who God is, then notice Paul goes on to say that by testing, you may discern what is the will of God, what is good and acceptable and perfect. It's as our thoughts begin to align more with the truth of God and the way He speaks and the way He thinks, and all of a sudden we're going to be able to discern better, more clearly in terms of how we relate to people, how we respond to people, the decisions that we have to make in life. Because the Bible's not going to answer every question, like should I get chocolate or vanilla? Should I go to In-N-Out or should I go, to some other places? Like the Bible doesn't answer those questions, but in those questions of life, if your mind is being renewed daily by the Lord, transformed in Scripture, in prayer, in good fellowship with other people, then when you start dealing with people, you'll be able to engage on a more just a spiritually rational and wise way. And so I would just encourage you with that. Lean hard into the Lord, because when you're confident and settled in your trust with Him, then you'll be able to deal on a horizontal level with people that may not be on solid ground with trust. It's a bit shaky, but at least you know that you're leaning into someone that is fully reliable.
Good advice. Good advice. Nikki, does that help at all?
It absolutely does. I'm just ready to, I'm visualizing my spiritual muscle.
That's beautiful.
I'm going to start working out, and that on a daily, and basis for sure. Thank you. That makes sense, and I feel like I'm looking forward to whatever my future is with my brother. Really, so yeah. Thank you guys so much. God bless you guys.
Well, God bless you, Nikki. Thank you for contacting us from Menifee here on Pastor's Perspective. 888-564-6173 is the number to call if you want to talk to John Huang, Dr. Bobby Conway, or Pastor Phil Metzger. We're going to go down to Long Beach now and talk to Richard. Richard, welcome to the program.
Hi, gentlemen. Thanks for taking my call. Hope you're all doing well.
Thank you, Richard.
I wanted to ask, well, first, I guess for some context, I'm 30 years old. I work in vocational ministry. And over the years, I've just become fascinated with textual criticism. And so I guess I wanted to ask you guys if you think it's wise for me to pursue a seminary degree towards that, even though right now I'm not exactly sure what I would do with it.
That's a good question. Dr. Bobby Conway, what would you say?
Well, it depends on your life circumstances. And so there is a number of questions. If you're married and you've got kids and you're already busy and you don't have a call to ministry, then I would say probably not, because you're going to spend a lot of money, a lot of time, and it's going to take you away from your family. If you're single and you have funds that can allow you to do this and you're not stressed out with your work, then absolutely. So it depends upon a number of things like that. You know, if you're married, does your wife support the decision to do so? I think if you're sensing a tug into textual criticism to be a professor or to work with manuscripts in the future, maybe ask God to confirm that before you go make such a big investment, because typically he gives you, a vision and then he grows you into it. And so asking if that's part of the vision for your future. If it's just a hobby, you don't have to go to seminary to do that, but it is trickier because textual criticism is something that is very much helped. Like getting a degree in leadership is pretty easy, right? I mean, just practical leadership stuff. Getting a degree in textual criticism is going to be really challenging. It's not that the leadership degree is easy in the sense of time, but it's not hard to read the 10 principles of this or business management principles. That stuff's quick to absorb. But textual criticism requires a lot of attention to detail, which you probably already have if you are interested in it. You might want to even just audit a class out of Dallas Theological Seminary. Dan Wallace is there, one of the great text critics in the world, and you could do that. And so maybe you audit a class and then just kind of do the papers, do all the assignments of what it would be like, to see if you enjoy it, to see what kind of time that takes from you, and then to continue to pray and see what God would have for you in the future.
Good advice. Good advice. Richard, does that help?
Yes, that's extremely helpful. Thank you.
All right, Richard.
Yeah.
Thank you for calling us here on Pastor's Perspective. 888-564-6173 is the number to call. Quickly, see if I can get Darlene in real quick. Darlene, you have a question for Pastor Bobby. Is that right?
Yes. I'm a little hoarse. I apologize. Can you guys hear me?
Yes, we can hear you. Go ahead quickly.
Okay. I was listening to Pastor Bobby's sermon on biblical voting, which I thought was very informative. I wish this had came out months ago so I could have shared it as many people as possible. But one of the things he was talking about is, I think it was point number 7, willingly vote for benefits of others, even if it means forsaking government entitlements for yourself. Could you just go into that a little bit more before I go to my ballot?
Did you get all that, Bobby?
Yeah. Yes. I think, was she asking me to elaborate on that point a little bit?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Hi, Darlene. Good to hear from you. I know we're going to come up to a station break, so maybe I'll kick it back to you, Michael, and I'll hit that on the other side.
Okay. All right. Well, and we are in a voting season right now. We definitely want to encourage everyone to get out there and let your voice be heard. It's important for us to vote. because if we don't vote, we'll get the kind of government we deserve. An elderly man told me that who's in the Lord now, but that's very, very true. And his dad told him that. So if you haven't voted, please get out there and vote. And we're going to answer Darlene's question when we come back. Also, we're going to Hannah from Orange. Hang on there. We want to talk to you as well. The number to call is 888-564-6173. Again, 888-564-6173. Dr. Bobby Conway, John Huang, and Phil Metzger are here to answer your questions on the Bible, the Christian faith, and how to live the Christian life. So we'll be with you in 2 minutes. Stay with us. Hello and welcome to the second half of Pastor's Perspective. I'm Michael David in for Mr. Brian Perez. Brian Perez is actually going to be out at Calvary Life in Gardena for their Halloween alternative event tonight. You can get all the details about that when you go to calvarylife.com/harvest. If you're in the area, come on down and enjoy it. It goes from 5 to 9 p.m. Again, that's Calvary Life Harvest Fest. They're at 19300 South Vermont Avenue in Gardena from 5 to 9 p.m. And Brian Perez will be there. You can meet him in person if you'd like to do that. And I suggest you do if you're in the area. And again, you can get all the details about it at calvarylife.com/harvest, or just go to our flagship stations, kwave.com, and go to the events page. On today's program, we have Pastor John Huang, we have Dr. Bobby Conway, and Pastor Phil Metzger. And before we went to the break, we were answering a question from Darlene, and she had a question for Dr. Bobby Conway, and he was going to give the answers. So, Dr. Bobby, why don't you go ahead and answer that now?
Yeah, so the question was pertaining to voting biblically, and one of my points was sometimes we have to be willing to give up the benefit of others, or sometimes we have to be willing to give up the benefit to ourselves if it means that our vote can help those who are being oppressed. And the example I gave of this, so sometimes people say, oh, you know what, we just need to not get engaged in politics. And so you take, for example, William Wilberforce. If he would have made that decision, politics was influential in the abolition of slavery. But those slave owners, what they needed to do is they needed to be willing to give up the government entitlements that they were getting by having slaves that put money in their pockets, and they had to realize that they were equal in value and dignity, and they needed to give up those benefits to free the oppressed, those who are in slavery. And I think that sometimes people get myopic. What's going to line our pockets the most? And so being passionate, I got a PhD in moral philosophy, right? And so one of the things that I would talk about as it relates to values is there's a hierarchy of values. And I think it's important that people think about that. So when you're voting, if you think about, oh, what's going to give me the best tax breaks, and that becomes your driving piece, well, that shouldn't be the driving piece by which we vote. That's a part of what we think about, right? When you're looking at all the issues. So first and foremost, as Michael, you were saying, which your voice is just unbelievably made for radio, dude. You just kill it. I would say a lot of Christians have strong convictions about politics, but little awareness about what the Bible has to say about the issues from front to back. And so first and foremost, we need to know what the issues are. Then we should have a biblical theology of those issues. And so take immigration, take these different points. Can we derive principles from that? And I believe you can. Like you just take, for example, immigration. And then you think about when they were in the wilderness under a theocracy, they were expected to go by the Yahweh covenant that there is one God. And God knew that if people came in from surrounding nations and couldn't sign off on that theocratic constitution, that there's one God, that would mess up the purpose of a theocracy. And so in our own culture today, we have a constitution in the same way that we wouldn't want to take we couldn't go into a land of Sharia law and be a Democrat in the sense of, or a Republican for that matter, and try to bring a democratic republic to it. That would be something that they would resist. So we have to hold fast to making sure that we align with our Constitution. Now, the government's in purpose, Romans 13, to protect to do good and to protect those who are oppressed. And so what does it mean to do good? There's a virtue side of what it means. And so we need to be thinking in terms of ethical. So ethics is a higher virtue than lining our pockets with money. Money is a benefit. But then you start thinking about, okay, so what are the issues? And you might take something like racial issues, or you might take abortion issues. Okay, you should be able to say that both are wrong. And regardless of which side you're on as a Christian, you need to call out that racial issues is wrong and abortion is wrong. But let's just say, for a hypothetical purpose, to get at the highest value, right? And you have to digest this kind of a thing. Like, what would be worse if somebody raped somebody or somebody murdered somebody? Well, the justice system would punish somebody for murder with life in prison. Somebody with rape, maybe 20, 30 years. They're both horrible. But what you're trying to do is think about what this hierarchy of values is. It's not saying that this isn't valuable, but sometimes people say, all sin is sin. Well, one sin can separate us from God, but even the government recognizes that's why you have people as judges. They adjudicate wrongdoings, and there's first-degree murder, second-degree murder. There's all sorts of hierarchies of values. And so for me, the driving piece then is abortion, because abortion takes away the life. So you take immigration. I think immigrants should come to the country. My great-grandparents came through Ellis Island. So I'm absolutely for immigrants coming. But to get at understanding the hierarchy of values, how could I get there? Well, if you had to choose between, because sometimes you have to make these tough moral dilemmas. If it meant that some immigrants had to get sent back and you didn't want them to go back, but it meant that you would have a better law protecting abortion more, well then, in the one sense, the people still have their life, though they don't have the country they want. In the other sense, they don't have a country because they don't have a life. And so you start thinking through values like that. And that's what I encourage, is having a hierarchy of values, and then being willing to give up thinking of terms of a voting for your benefits exclusively. And that can get myopic, because sometimes people can vote based on what's going to be best for their ethnicity. And that would be myopic. We should never just think about voting only for that purpose, because we're not part of just one ethnicity. We're part of a United States of different ethnicities. So we want to think holistically as well. And those are just some guiding principles that hopefully can help people think about voting.
Very good advice. Very good advice. Wise counsel, Dr. Bobby Conway. Darlene, does that help you?
Yes. Can I just ask one more question?
Sure. Go ahead.
Well, it's actually a concern. I go to a church that's very, very highly for one particular party, and it's very obvious when it gets towards voting season. And it somewhat has turned me off, because I know there are people in that congregation who are from Republican, Democrat, Independent, and there's some who don't even vote. But our church tends to truly lean to one particular way. Is that a reason to make? My husband and I have been thinking maybe this isn't the right church for us. I don't want it to be more emotionally based, but it is something that is of a concern for us, because we feel like everyone's unable to speak freely because of different viewpoints they may have.
That's a good question. And I want to hear from all three pastors on this, because I think all three of you must have had to deal with this in this election season. We'll start with you, Dr. Bobby Conway. What would you say?
Okay, so Darlene, here's what's happening to me a little bit. Typically, it's good to just talk about the issues and avoid the whole party thing. I think the question all of us have to ask, is there ever a point where a party can go so far off the deep end that it becomes a moral imperative for us to speak? So take, for example, let's just, for hypothetical, we got to run these cases because we say, we can never talk about the party. I go, but is that really true? Is that a moral directive in Scripture that we can? Well, no, because we don't even talk about the Democratic Republican. We're still drawing principles. But in the case of like Bonhoeffer, he had to make a hard decision to come out and say, you know what? Hitler's going to really be a problem here. In fact, he went so far as to try to commit an assassination attempt on him. Thankfully, we're not there. I fear that in the future, if we're not wise, because you have platforms that are so progressive, and many people in the church don't realize that the roots of cultural Marxism is behind this stuff. So if I bring up critical race theory, for example, oftentimes people are ignorant that it's a combination of postmodern deconstruction combined with cultural Marxism. And so Paulo Freire in the 90s, his education, who was a social Marxist, was put in 95% of the public schools. Now you watch these emerging kids and they're total activists. And their worldview is to see things through the lens of oppressed oppressor. They don't even know the philosophy necessarily that's driving them, but they are activists. Well, if we continue down a line of getting these types of principles in place that just splits us off from one another and sees everything through oppressed oppressor, this emerging generation is going to be primed to walk right into platforms, and censorship will be right on the way. And this is one of the dangers of the Equality Act. It will really threaten our freedoms. And so I'm at a point, and I don't know that everybody's going to have to differ on this, where I want to give strong warnings to this. And when I'm reading on the left, it feels like I'm reading Romans chapter 1 and the vices. And so I'm being honest about that, but I also need to say, I realize that everybody's not thinking through this perhaps. I realize God's invited me to be a little bit more courageous. I don't want to be behind the ball. And I also think that we got to give the benefit of the doubt that when people are voting in a way that we don't see, people on the other side are equally like, how could you vote for Trump? I just would raise the question, remove Trump from the picture and say, okay, now J.D. Vance is there. Is it not obvious? Okay, so I would say something like that. And then if they'd still say, but there's people that are voting Democrat because they see that they're going to provide the best benefits, because they hear words like compassion and education. But what do they mean by compassion? What do they mean by education? What kind of education? And so helping our people to think and knowing that they don't necessarily, I don't think they mean ill at all. I think they're trying to do what they believe is best. And there's a lot of godly Christians that love Jesus on both sides. But I want to talk about these ideas because ideas have consequences.
Yes, very true. And like you said, Dr. Bobby, there are good, godly people on both sides, and I imagine you have that in all of your churches. In fact, Phil Metzger, do you have that situation where you are at Calvary in San Diego?
Yeah, and I want to kind of get back to that kind of her question on this a bit too, and just say, I kind of share her same concern that regardless of the issues, and we can make these moral kind of these issues, but I want to reach people with the gospel of Jesus, no matter who they vote for. And I find that if I lean myself in, there is this kind of case to be made, like, yes, but then what's it going to do for our whole society? I'm really concerned about the person right in front of me more than I am just the bigger picture, if I'm honest. I take that love my neighbor a little bit more. I'm like a local pastor of a local church. My calling is I'm just trying to reach the people who walk in the doors or maybe will listen online. And I am hoping, my concern is that churches are no longer places where people who don't think the same ideology as the pastor, they don't go to them anymore. And that concerns me. It concerns me that churches have become so ideologically based that we've lost gospel-centeredness. And I am not a person who says the only thing that matters is the gospel and nothing else matters. I believe that because the gospel matters, everything matters, but it matters in a much different proportion. So I am concerned about, it's election week and month and year, so everybody's focused on issues and things like that. But I, as a pastor, I hope that I have people who vote on both sides, who come together and worship Jesus together and are learning how to live together and whatever that looks like. I just want to see people know Christ. So I personally won't be a person who's making a case either way. I read all the pastors telling me how wrong I am for doing that, and I should be hitting this particular issue. But golly, if you sit down with people on both sides, you realize they have really, really incredibly valid points for their moral, ethical, and spiritual decisions. And so I want to just reach whoever walks through the door. I want to reach them with the gospel.
Amen. Amen. And Pastor John, you've been a pastor for many years in other countries as well. Mm-hmm. You've probably seen every political ideology you can see. How do you handle that as a pastor, dealing with so many different viewpoints?
Well, for me, I am so grateful that we live in a country that we actually have this amazing privilege to vote. Right? Because not everybody in the world has that. And so, for example, when you read in Scripture, it wasn't like the early church had a choice, Nero or no Nero, right? It's like Nero was the guy that was in power, or Domitian was the one who was in power. And depending upon who was seated there in the government of Rome, that determined if you were going to have a peaceful life or you were going to have a turbulent life. And persecution's always going to be a part of it, but there were some periods that were more peaceful than others. And even when Paul was writing to Timothy and exhorted Timothy to encourage the church to pray for kings and rulers, he said, which is really interesting, that we may lead a peaceful and quiet life, godly and dignified in every way. Because in those times where there was those moments of reprieve, there was more of an opportunity for people to be out in the open, living for Christ and sharing the gospel with other people. And even though in history, in times of intense persecution, that's when the church actually became more aggressive in the world. But we also see in moments where there was more openness, where the government was quieter, that Christians had more access, like Paul being able to go into the marketplaces or people going out and being able to share. So I think that for us as the church, I think that rather than us just trying to find our way to fight for the what was the American dream or the American way in order for us to, amass our material possessions, I think that we need to see bigger than that we're called into a kingdom life, that the privileges that we have as an American living in a free country, that the fact that we don't have the level of persecution that other countries have, that should motivate us and give us a reason to utilize this time of peace to share the gospel with as many people as we can. But having said that, though, Bobby, I got to say, I'm so grateful that you said what you said, because I think that so often there seems to be just one of two choices, right? You either have the church that is super politically vocal, but then you have the other church, because they're so disgusted by that that they go to the other extreme and they say nothing at all. And sometimes there's even this timidity that I've felt even in me sometimes, that if I say anything that is an issue deal, then, oh my gosh, people are going to misunderstand me of being political. But I think that part of our pastoral responsibilities is, like what Bob was saying, is to educate God's people, God's flock. So we may not necessarily say, vote one party over another party, unless, like what Bobby was saying, if it came down to a point where, swastikas are being unfurled and Jews are being put into cattle cars and they're going to be going off to be murdered in concentration camps and gas chambers, then the church hopefully would speak up. One of the problems is there were a lot of churches that weren't speaking up during that time, that Hitler was doing what he was doing. And so voices like Bonhoeffer was rare. And so I think that in pastoral ministry, there's got to be an element. I just finished doing a lecture on the life of John Calvin. And whatever you believe about Calvin, positive or good, the one thing that we can't miss is here was a guy that was fully devoted and dedicated to God and his glory. But while he was in Geneva, he was first and foremost a pastor. And a lot of times people want to look at him and say, no, he was a politician there in Geneva. No, he was a pastor. And the thing is that in his pastoral role, he really sought to educate. And Timothy Keller was saying that even discipleship was too weak of a word. He was all about the spiritual formation of those people, and it takes biblical education. And I think that what Bobby has done and the way that he's done it in terms of being able to try to educate people on a lot of these issues and to present a biblical worldview, I really like that. And I
Thanks,
think,
John.
Yeah, I think that I think it's a really good balance, but it takes some grit. It takes some grace and it takes grit to be able to do that, and it takes a lot of thought. And I think that's one of the things I hope more pastors would do is, rather than be reactionaries, actually look at the issues and start thinking deeply about this stuff and formulating those thoughts to be able to pastor your sheep well by educating them spiritually.
Great.
I think that this is something that. Okay, so for me on this, I love what you guys are saying. If I'm being honest, the work I'm sensing God doing in me, because we all recognize our country's a complete mess. Obviously, the gospel's a solution, but what is causing so much of the mess is, the church needs to do a better job, but the church has been pandering to culture, and the church is caving in. And you have a situation where we have a lot of ideology that has emerged in the last decade as it relates to LGBT. It's the critical theory stuff that's knocking stuff down. And so I just feel like I'm a bit of a people pleaser. I want people to like me. And God is inviting me to at least speak up about the warnings, because when I consider intellectual history and how these cultures change, we are at what you look in when if you look at a Babylon or a Greece or a Rome or Persia, and you see some of these countries, we are kind of at that space now where the church is, it's selling out, morals are just going off the deep end. There's passivity amongst spiritual leaders. And I don't want to be that, because I feel there's an inconsistency to me when I try to teach people how to have a biblical worldview on so many areas of life. And yet, when it comes to the government piece, I'm not going to actually speak out. And because I want people to think about that, I'll speak out. But I realize that it's not me forcing anybody to go. I'm not saying what people need to do, but I do think that if pastors would warn and equip and make people aware of a worldview, and if they would teach their congregations to see the cultural Marxism behind this stuff, and honestly, getting at this stuff is tough work. It is I think it's so complicated where we are. But if censorship really happens, like this Equality Act can make a lot of problems for the church. And I just don't want to be like sitting back, because there will be a place where people will speak up. And I'd rather be ahead of it than wait till it gets to a point where it's just brutal. And so I'm just trying to send the warnings. And I was saying to the church, I said, hey, we're going to have a pronoun issue in the country way before it came, and people were thinking you're crazy. Hey, we're going to have same-sex marriage in our country. And it came. And hey, we're going to see a lot of confusion as it relates to this emerging generation in the faith. And so we need to prophetically warn of what's happening, and what is shaping people. One area is the way that people think politically. And so we should at least challenge them to think about those ideas and to be able to make a biblical case for why they believe what they believe.
All right. Thank you very much, gentlemen, for those questions. Darlene, thank you for calling us here on Pastor's Perspective, sponsored by Biola University, ranked as the most comprehensively Christian school in North America. We're going to go to Hannah. Hannah, thank you for holding. What's your question?
So my question is, just as Christians, should we be participating in Halloween? And more importantly, should we be allowing our young children to be participating in activities at public school that relate to Halloween?
Good question. Phil Metzger, I know you've got an event going on today, and Brian Perez, it is the one today as well. What do you say about that?
As it relates, Hannah, to public school events, I went to 2 because my grandkids are in them, and they were great. Just simple trunk or treat. So I don't know what your school's doing. Everybody's got to, you got to figure things out, in your own area and whatnot. But, I think that like we can participate. Halloween is, at least in America, I spent most of my adult life not in America, but I can say being here and seeing America in the last 6 years as an adult here, Halloween's like a cultural American event. Like it's candy. Yeah, it can have a, kind of a dark, that old, people can get into that dark thing, and that we want to avoid that as much as possible. But I think in terms of like elementary schools, I know the ones we went to, their whole purpose was, hey, let's make sure it stays family friendly and all that. So I don't think there's some like Christian imperative that you cannot, but let your conscience speak to you and make sure that you feel okay with that. I also think, participating as like a part of a neighborhood and handing out candy there's nothing wrong with that. It might be an opportunity for just showing that you're a part of your community. You're not against people. Our faith does not stand in opposition to the idea of kids dressing up and going around their neighborhood with their parents. On every day, 365 days out of the year, we're against any, we stand against darkness, but that's because of Christ. And so we, even against the darkness that's in our own hearts, that we're asking God to reveal and to expose and to forgive us of. So I don't think it makes a point that like, if I stand against Halloween, I'm standing against darkness. We need to be doing that every day of the year. But I do think we can engage with Halloween in ways that are, kind and neighborly, and might even open up good opportunities for further engagement and conversation.
Great answer, Phil Metzger. Phil Metzger, John Huang, Dr. Bobby Conway, thank you for joining us on today's program on Pastor's Perspective. We will see you next time. Be sure to get out there and vote. God's on the throne no matter who wins on Tuesday. And I want to let you know Pastor's Perspective is sponsored by Biola University, ranked as the most comprehensively Christian school in North America.